The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, in some ways this is the sort of debate that is the most important debate that we ever have in the House of Representatives, and that is because we deal with fundamental responsibilities that we have in this place. First, to safeguard our citizens against real or potential risks, and then secondly, to make a decision about how a nation like New Zealand should respond to the risks and the threats created by the wider situation in the Middle East. And I say the wider situation in the Middle East, Mr Speaker, because you can't differentiate the threat that ISIS poses from the factors that have led to their creation, which is the appalling humanitarian conditions that emanated from the oppression by Bashar al-Assad in Syria on one hand, and secondly the appalling things that were happening in Iraq, not only Sunni against Shia but Shia against Sunni. So when we start to talk about the threats and the appalling brutality in the Middle East, let's not pretend for a moment that we're only talking about one organisation, ISIS. Yes, it is brutal. Yes, it is disgusting. Yes, it poses a potential threat. But I have to say, it has killed nothing like the 200,000 people in Syria who have died because of the actions of Bashar al-Assad. And equally, if you look at the problem in Iraq, it is not, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs stated before, simply something that resulted from the Maliki Prime Ministership. It is something that goes back to the misguided decision in 2003 to invade Iraq without proper preparation and without any examination of the unintended consequences of that action. Now, I want to come back and I want to divide my comments up into two parts. One, the question of what threat might exist in New Zealand and how we respond to it, and secondly, how we should respond to that broader situation in the Middle East. The first thing I have to say, Mr Speaker, is that I welcome the fact that the government has been more forthcoming in terms of its proposals and sharing it with other political parties, but I do express my regret that this is legislation that will be passed in 2 weeks after we come back from the House. That, in my view, is insufficient time for this House to give proper scrutiny to the fundamental issues that are involved whenever you extend the powers of a security intelligence organisation. I think offsetting that is that there will be a sunset clause, that the government has limited what it has put into, or what it intends to put into that legislation, and that at the insistence of the Labor Party there will be at least a truncated select committee process so we can allow public and specialist input into the legislation. I want to say, Mr Speaker, that it is important that we are vigilant about the threats posed by terrorism, but we should also be proportionate and balanced. I lived in the United Kingdom at the time of the IRA terrorist attacks. That was far more extensive than anything that we have seen from ISIS. That's just a fact. I was working in Parliament buildings in the Commons, and there was a real and present threat to the lives of people living in the United Kingdom because of the actions of the IRA. We did not, however, brand it with an ideology such as Islamic, and the British government dealt with it. I have to say to the Prime Minister as well, I read his speech carefully, and there were things that I agreed with in the speech and there were things that I disagreed with. One was the impression given that the international environment has become much less benign over time. I was Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time of 9/11. I can tell you that when you had a synchronised and coordinated attack that killed thousands of people in the United States, that was bigger than anything that I've felt from ISIS in New Zealand and internationally. When the biggest country in the world closes its borders, that is not benign. So let's see this in context. Yes, we should take ISIS seriously, but no, we should not blow it out of proportion into something that it isn't. And I'm also old enough to remember the dark days of the Cold War, when we had multiple nuclear weapons on high alert, and the world, or civilization as we know it, could have come to an end at any particular occasion. So yeah, let's take the threat seriously, but let's keep it proportionate. It's also important domestically not to go too far in the legislation, Mr. Speaker, because we know that what causes radicalising of a minority part of the population is when you create conditions where they feel alienated and where they feel that they are being discriminated against. I've got a significant Muslim population in my electorate. I've known them for years. I've worked with them for years. I can say that this is a group in my community that's hard-working, peaceful and law-abiding. But if we start to create the impression that Islamic equals terrorism, and we start to see New Zealanders being abusive of Muslim people in this country, then we will create the very conditions that we're setting out to avoid. And I have to say, talking to many of my Muslim friends, they are subject in the street because of their appearance or their dress to increasing abuse. So more important than this legislation might be dealing with the situation, and I acknowledge John Key said in his speech that our Muslim community is overwhelmingly positive and law-abiding. More important might be how we ensure that that community does not feel so alienated from the community that it is part of, that we create the conditions for action by people with personality disorders. Mr. Speaker, I think that the moves that are made in the proposed legislation are not extreme moves. We have the Search and Surveillance Act, and I can't see why powers that are available to the police might not be available to the SIS when confronting similar situations. But naturally, we want to be clear about the safeguards to prevent the abuse of that power. The reason that we don't have visual surveillance provisions in the SIS bill is I think it dates back to 1969. I acknowledge to the Attorney-General that there might be some occasions when he's not available to sign a warrant, but we do live in the 21st century, and I don't think it ever takes 48 hours to get in touch with the Attorney-General. If it does, we would have to wonder what he was up to and why. I think that in the Select Committee, we need to say, yes, there may be a provision where in an emergency situation the action takes place, but no, we're not going to leave it for 48 hours before we regularise that warrant. And that's something that I hope that we can look at in good faith in the Select Committee. I want to come finally on the question of passports. The right to travel freely is a precious right, but it's not an absolute right. If somebody in New Zealand, we know, and it doesn't matter whether it's ISIS or any other UN-designated terrorist organisation, if we know a person is about to head off and join an organisation that the UN regards as committing crimes against humanity and war crimes, then of course we have a responsibility to stop that person. We should not, however, render people stateless that are currently travelling on passports, and it is critical that if a person overseas loses their passport because it's taken away from them, then we have an immediate availability of travel documents to allow them to return to New Zealand, and I hope that's what the government is proposing. What I want to say finally about the contribution of the campaign against ISIS is there's a lot we can do on a humanitarian basis. We can make a difference. There are millions of refugees. That is where we should be focusing. We can make a difference in our role on the United Nations Security Council. When we sit down in Washington with other countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey, who are part of the coalition of the willing, and find out that the resources, the money, the people and the weapons are coming from those very countries, then that's the place to start to isolate ISIL and to defeat it. I am not convinced at all that military action is appropriate in these circumstances. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yes, there might have been good intentions to remove Saddam or to remove Gaddafi, But as a result of misguided efforts by the West, hundreds of thousands of innocent people lost their lives, and we ended up with a situation much worse than it was even under those oppressive regimes. We should be very wary of entering in a military capacity in any sense that conflict in the Middle East.